crowd. Excited to be a brand new school year. Really welcome, happy to welcome, especially first-year students, first-year graduate students. Welcome to Duke. I was just telling one of my students, coming to these events and participating in, the life outside the classroom is really an important part of your Duke education. So exposing yourself to these great scholars, practitioners who come in and visit with us is really eye-opening, sometimes life-changing. So I encourage you, I'm talking to the wrong people because you came, you're here. But I encourage you to keep doing that as you can. Schoolwork will build up. Yes, I understand that. But as you can, and welcome, of course, to our participants in our American Grant Strategy Program. We are thrilled to have Thomas Brzozowski from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Counsel for Domestic Terrorism here. I'm going to introduce him in a sec, but I want to say a couple program notes and other things before we start. I just want to say, I think, especially for the newcomers, almost nothing that you do that is important or fun can take place here at Duke without the hard work of our staff. And I just want to acknowledge KB in the back, who's been working on this event for 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm so thrilled to be working with her. Welcome to our program, and thank her for all the efforts making everything, a full day of activities happen. So let's give her a round of applause. Thank you. And those of you who have questions about American Grant Strategy Program or anything that's going on in this area, KB is the person you to contact. I also want to welcome on his, I think, 5th day of work or 3rd day of work, I'm not sure, our new staff person, Ryan Glennon, who's also going to be supporting a lot of our efforts in the national security area. Welcome, Ryan, and thanks for your help today. A couple of program notes coming up. We are doing something new this year in AGS. We're having a most of the day long program called Military 101 for students who always wanted to learn a little bit about what our armed forces did, how they work, how they're structured. Slight bit of classroom learning, but also some fun. I don't think there'll be any shooting of weaponry, but I think there's going to be maybe some ropes course and other fun things to do. So if you have some free time on this Saturday, September 10th, you should go onto the American Grant Strategy website and send KB an email and sign up for the program. I know it's going to be a lot of fun. It's being led by a couple of our MPPs who are currently in active duty. So please sign up for that. Next lecture / discussion, September 21st with Joseph Torgan, part of Simon Miles' History and Public Policy series. And this event has to do with Russia-China relations. So it's not relevant, interesting, or to anything that's going on in the world. So no, you'll definitely want to come to that. And then finally, the annual Gettysburg Staff Ride is going to take place in October. If you haven't been to Gettysburg and haven't participated in a staff ride, this is something you really should take advantage of. When I went, it was mid-November, and the whole group almost froze to death. But we're going in late October. It should be beautiful. The leaves should be turning in southern Pennsylvania. So that's the staff ride itself is on October 22nd, 23rd. You do stay overnight in Gettysburg. You have a very nice dinner as well. And but we need to get your application in by September 20. Okay, that's a couple of weeks. So if you want to go, and I do encourage you to go if you haven't had a chance, please look onto the AGS website and you'll find all the information you need. Okay, on to tonight's event. We are so thrilled to welcome Thomas Brzozowski. Let me tell you a little bit about him, and then he can say hello to you. But he's had certainly a very distinguished career, a graduate of William and Mary. He has only three graduate degrees. I won't go into all of those, but he was doing ROTC, as an undergrad, then went into active duty in the Army, became a lawyer, then became an Army JAG. He is still in the Army Reserves, and he's had a 25-year career in the combination of the Army and Reserves. So, sir, thank you for your service. He joined the FBI General Counsel's Office in 2010, and then came to his current position at the Department of Justice in 2015. So, Thomas Brzozowski, welcome to Duke.
Well, thank you very much. And first and foremost, I want to thank you, Professor Schanzer and Duke, for the opportunity to discuss some issues that I think are pretty important. So again, thank you for the opportunity.
Well, let's go at it. Although I just want to point out that when I first invited you, I realized it was the right thing to fit so well into Duke, because I recognize that, like a very famous, well, probably the most famous Dookie, your name has a tremendous number of consonants in it. That Dookie makes things easier for himself by calling him Coach K. So I was thinking of calling you Lawyer B. How does that sound?
Go for it. Whatever works for you. It's good for me.
Well, let's dive right into it and get at the outset just a little bit of understanding of what it is that we're talking about. This term, domestic terrorism. And we discussed this before. Domestic terrorism is nothing new in America. You could say it came with us right at the beginnings of our very formation or before as a nation. Of course, the most notorious domestic terrorist organization, I think, in the history of America is the Klan, both its 19th and 20th century iterations. We've discussed in the 1960s many different kinds of radical organizations engaging in violence. There were many, many more bombings, terrorism incidents in the 1960s and early 70s than there have been in this 21st century. Yet now we have this position in the Department of Justice. You're the Domestic Terrorism Counsel. We have a label that we are putting on a certain kind of conduct. Why, tell us, why do we need or have this idea of domestic terrorism now? And since you're the Domestic Terrorism Counsel at the Justice Department, what does that term mean to you?
Well, let me start by addressing the point you made in your earlier remarks, namely about the KKK, for example. Our Attorney General has on a number of occasions highlighted a pretty significant historical fact associated with the Department of Justice in connection with the KKK. So in many respects, the modern Department of Justice, as it's presently structured, was created at the same time during Reconstruction, for example. And in many respects, it was designed with a view, at least initially, to combat some of the pernicious effects of the KKK. You could view some of the first legislation, federal legislation, that concerned domestic terrorism as being what are called the enforcement acts. These were pieces of federal legislation that occurred in the immediate aftermath of the Reconstruction that were directed towards allowing federal authorities to contend with the surge of terrorist activity associated with the Ku Klux Klan. So our history at the department is very much bound up with the KKK in many material respects. And that point has not been lost on our leadership. Now, what do we mean presently in the contemporary environment when we say domestic terrorism? And this is really important to get a grip on. Because the term regrettably has been used as something of a political cudgel of late. What we mean, and when I say we, I'm referring to the Department of Justice and by extension the FBI, the departments and agencies that have primary jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute domestic terrorism. What do we mean when we say domestic terrorism? Well, what we're referring to is a very specific statutory definition in our criminal code. That's Title 18. It's a statutory definition that you can find at 18, not to go too deep in the law with you, but 18 USC 2331 parenthetical 5, if you want to check it out. And I'll paraphrase it for you, for those that are not well versed in Title 18. In effect, it defines domestic terrorism as involving activities, involve acts that are dangerous to human life, that appear to be intended to coerce or intimidate a civilian population, or to affect the policy of a government through coercion or intimidation. There's a little bit more to it. If you look it up, you'll see there's another prong to it. But in material respects, that's what I'm getting at there. So that's the statutory definition of domestic terrorism. Why is this important? Why do we care about this? Well, as I said, it's a statutory definition. And what I'm trying to convey to you there is it's the law. Statutes are laws. Congress passed it. And we are committed to combating all forms of domestic and international terrorism, while at the same time upholding the civil liberties of all American citizens. So that's our remit, the Department of Justice, as it were, especially in the National Security Division. And that's why it's of central importance to understand precisely what we mean when we say domestic terrorism.
We've talked about this a couple of times in the other forums you've been to, but I think it's still an important point that's worth this audience understanding as well. Sometimes we can understand domestic terrorism a little bit by talking about how international terrorism is combated and draw the contrast. And as you pointed out, the government has many, many tools to deal with international terrorism, but I think the one that everybody is most familiar with is the fact that we have a foreign terrorist organization list. It is controlled by the State Department, and then there are numerous organizations, foreign organizations on that list. You're familiar with some of them: Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas. And then if you do anything to help one of those, hello? Yes, you do anything to aid or assist, or under the law called materially support one of those organizations, you've committed a very serious crime. And that tool has been used very strongly by the government in dealing with international terrorism. So some people might say, well, we could do the same thing for domestic terrorism. If we have domestic terrorist organizations, we could put them on a list them all, they're all bad organizations. And then if you help, aid, assist any of those organizations in any way, you have now committed a crime, but we don't do that. So maybe I think maybe you can help understand by this example why domestic terrorism is such an interesting but also difficult problem to get at.
Right. And so what you say is correct, of course. Presently, we don't have a legal framework that would allow the government to ban or prescribe purely domestic organizations in the same manner that we have available for banning or designating, whatever term you choose to use, foreign terrorist organizations. There are a couple of reasons for that. Some have called for Congress to pass such a legislative framework. Others suggest that in doing so, that might run into some constitutional headwinds associated with the First Amendment's right to peaceably assemble, for example, or association, or speech, as it were. So as it stands right now, there presently is no mechanism for the government to ban or prescribe purely domestic organizations in the same manner that there is for foreign terrorist organizations. And consequently, we do not have a measure to charge somebody with providing, as you say, material support to a domestic terrorist organization because, like I just said, there's no such thing as a domestic terrorist organization list. You will not find that anywhere in any, no government agency or department maintains such a list. Whereas the State Department, as you rightly note, does. You can pull it up on Google right now if you so choose. So that's the kind of the legal architecture that we operate under presently.
Well, tell us a little bit about the threat profile as the United States government sees that today. We all know that there's certainly been an increase and an increased concern, but what can you tell us, as we sit here today, about what the government considers its, gravest domestic terrorism threats? What are the different subcomponents that are concerning to the government, and how serious a threat, of course, without talking about classified information, do we consider this?
Well, first and foremost, the job of identifying threat streams is that of the FBI. So what I'm telling you right now is more or less parroting what I take in from the FBI. And you will find that the leadership of both the Department of Justice and senior officials at the FBI, including the FBI director, will have said in the near past that the number one threat, domestic terrorism related threat in the country right now, concerns that of lone offenders. This should hardly be a shock to anybody. If you think back on some of the more catastrophic recent domestic terrorism related attacks, like the incident in Buffalo, or the incident at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or the incident in Charlottesville in 2017, or the incident in El Paso at the Walmart in 2019. All of these incidents were perpetrated by lone offenders that are otherwise unconnected to any network or organization. And that constitutes the number one domestic terrorism related threat. In terms of categories of domestic terrorists and their respective threat posture, the FBI will tell you, and the director has recently remarked, that the number one threat continues to be that associated with what the FBI terms racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. And these are individuals who commit violence pursuant to an ideology that is broadly animated by an animus towards a particular race or ethnicity. Close on the heels of that are threats that are derived from individuals that subscribe to a broadly anti-government or anti-authority philosophy or ideology. And those are the two principal threats that are front of mind as it stands right now.
We often heard about Antifa and left-wing or anarchist violence. First of all, is Antifa a group? And where does, whether it is or not, where does this kind of form of terrorism kind of fall on the DOJ FBI radar screen?
Right, there's certainly been a lot of conversation about Antifa, to be sure, and you will find that the FBI will say, and has consistently maintained, that it's not a networked or organized organization per se, rather a loose, perhaps a loose affiliation of individuals that may self-describe as Antifa, but again, what the FBI is not seeing is any sort of nationwide entity that could be styled as a coherent, command-driven organization or group. That said, the director has noted recently that there has been a recent fatality associated with, and again, we don't use the term left or right wing. That's not something that's in our vocabulary, but broadly anarchist-related fatality that has occurred in recent years, and that marks a significant departure from the type of threat posture we typically associate with that. But again, these threat pictures tend to evolve pretty quickly over the course of even sometimes weeks and months. So the best thing right now is to stay tuned to the most recent threat briefing issued by the FBI, and they're in the best position to give the broader public the most current threat picture as it relates to the domestic terrorism landscape.
So we're 4 days away from the 21st anniversary of 9/11. As a matter of fact, this speaker series, which you're now distinguished to be part of, always commemorates that anniversary. And if we look at 9/11, of course, a tremendously catastrophic, large-scale terrorist attack, the government spent a huge amount of time, effort, reorganization, creating new agencies, passing new legislation, spending a lot of money to develop all kinds of capabilities to deal with the threat. And I'd say my view is, looking back 21 years, especially if the goal was preventing Al-Qaeda and like-minded groups' ability to attack inside the homeland, it's been quite a successful effort. So now you've painted this landscape of domestic terrorism and an increasing domestic terrorism threat. What is the strategy? What are the government's tools? What is the government doing now? And are there kind of invigorated, energized efforts in light of this threat to protect the American public, like was occurred after 9/11 with respect to international terrorism?
Well, the first and foremost, what the government has done, it has promulgated the first ever national strategy to counter domestic terrorism. And again, this is brand new. It's never been done by any previous administration. That is to say, issuing a national level strategic document that focuses exclusively on domestic terrorism. So that's the first signal departure in terms of like how we're organizing to contend with the domestic terrorism threat. And within that strategy, there are assigned responsibilities for various federal departments and agencies to leverage their existing authorities to contend with the surge in domestic terrorism activity. So right now, presently, what we're doing is giving effect to those strategic objectives that are mapped out in that strategic level document. And that's kind of how strategy is built. I mean, you create a roadmap of those strategic objectives you hope to achieve, and then you create what's called a strategic implementation plan, which assigns very specific objectives, deliverables, if you will, to federal agencies and departments and state and local partners, by the way, and even some of our foreign partners, in order to give effect to the broader strategic objectives that are mapped out. So that's number one. And then as part of that process within the DOJ, we've instituted a number of changes that are, again, signal kind of a marked departure from how we normally do business. One of them concerns data. We had, prior to just a couple of years ago, not officially maintained very specific granular data associated with the number of individuals we have prosecuted for domestic terrorism, for example, over the course of, I don't know, say a calendar year. We now have regulatory guidance in place that directs federal prosecutors to provide that data to the National Security Division at the Department of Justice, and so that we can do a better job of getting a better sense of, from a DOJ perspective, what the nature of the threat is and how it can better direct our resources. Now, I want to hasten to add that the FBI has and does continue to maintain a very robust data set associated with the number of domestic terrorism investigations that may be occurring at any time. So I'm not trying to suggest that we don't care about the data, we do, but it's difficult to get our hands around, it's slippery. So we are instituting very concrete measures to do a better job in that area. We've also just announced, and my boss, the Attorney General for National Security Division at the DOJ, just recently announced the creation of what we call a domestic terrorism unit within the National Security Division. This entity, I'm a part of that effort, is new, and it's designed to better enable us to take a more in-depth look at the prosecutions that might be occurring all across the country as they relate to domestic terrorism. That's part one. Part two is to engage with the community, the broader community, the broader public on issues concerning domestic terrorism. And me being here today, that's part two. And as part of that, also to do more deliberate training with our state and local partners on issues concerning domestic terrorism. And then part three, of course, is what I've already mentioned, the new robust data collection associated with domestic terrorism. All this is new, and we're in the beta stages of building this out. But those are material changes that have occurred just in the course of the past 2 years that relate to domestic terrorism.
Is it possible to say that there's more money, more budget being spent, more prosecutors, more investigators, and so on, or is that not part of the strategy?
Well, yeah, I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts in terms of dollar figures. That's a little outside of, we got to talk to the budget folks on that. But what I can say is what I've just said, namely that the policy orientation has shifted to a certain extent with the advent of this new domestic terrorism policy strategy to counter domestic terrorism, and those signal changes that I've already outlined within the Department of Justice. And I will note that other departments and agencies have also implemented other measures that mark a change in terms of how they direct their authorities to bring them to bear on the domestic terrorism issue.
I want to get into some of the nuts and bolts, and hopefully you can maybe help us understand the substance of this issue a bit more. I was watching a presentation by Robert Pape. We discussed him earlier today, and he referenced a survey. This was quite stunning to me. Referenced a survey where he said 7% of the people surveyed said that both President Biden was not the legitimate president and that violence was justified to remove him from office. And then he extrapolated that 17% of the American public would be 18 million people And even if only 1% of those people would actually take some sort of action based on that, that's a that's 180, hate to multiply in public, but 180,000 Americans. So I'm wondering if you can enlighten us on the extent to which the department is concerned and watching and about how this stop the steal kind of narrative is affecting the potentiality for violence.
Well, what I can say, and again, I'm gonna refer to my original comments right out of the gate, namely, what we are concerned about is whether an individual or a group of individual is seeking to give expression to any ideology, irrespective of what that ideology might be, through violence. Full stop. That's the barometer that we use to gauge whether or not we should initiate and prosecute a particular domestic terrorism matter. And you know, so what we try to do, and we are very mindful that, again, this particular issue tends to generate a lot of heat, and it is political in nature, as all terrorism really is at its core. And so we need to hew as closely as possible to that statutory definition that I outlined earlier. And in that sense, the nature of the animating ideology is, from our perspective, certainly important in the sense that it has to be studied, it has to be understood, and we have teams of FBI analysts that do that, just that. But from a purely legal perspective, in most respects, the nature of the animating philosophy is largely immaterial. What we focus on exclusively is the violence. So if anybody looks to give effect to any ideology, whatever that might be, through violence, then that's going to be something that the FBI and the DOJ are going to be interested in dealing with.
But the FBI is also an intelligence gathering entity as well as a analytic. And again, to try to go back to my understanding of the post 9/11 era, I think we felt very strongly that to grapple with Al Qaeda and understand its organization, we needed to deeply understand the ideology, the motivations, what drove people to, both adopt these ideologies, and then how those narratives and ideologies and grievances could drive them towards violence. That must be part of also what the law enforcement and the FBI must be doing, some of that, to better understand and maybe help to predict when and where violence might occur. Isn't that also part of law enforcement's mission?
Well, of course.
We want to prevent, right? We don't want to just prosecute after stuff has happened.
That's certainly the case, and having the most fulsome picture of what the threat posture is at any given time is going to be a component of that, to be sure. That said, again, the nature of the intelligence as it relates to in the domestic terrorism context that the FBI is going to look at is largely gleaned from that which is derived from open investigations. So it's not as if the FBI will cast a wide net over the entire country to assess who is engaging in what sort of ideological viewpoint, and then walk backwards. It goes the other way around. Like, if an individual has indicated some indicia of giving effect to some kind of ideology, irrespective of what it is, through violence, that's the point at which the FBI will take a look at that particular individual. Now, in the aggregate, if there are any number of individuals who subscribe to the same philosophy and are looking to give effect to a similar philosophy through violence, that's going to be something that's going to be of concern to the FBI, to be sure. But there has to be some sort of law enforcement purpose at the outset for the FBI to become interested in what a given American might be saying or doing on a given occasion. And that law enforcement purpose in a domestic terrorism context is going to rely exclusively on indicia associated with a person's propensity for giving effect to that ideology through violence.
And of course, in a free society, we want that, right? We don't want our law enforcement to be wandering willy-nilly with a free rein to try to identify people they are concerned about and bring the heavy arm of the government down on them without evidence that they are engaged in some sort of criminal activity. So I feel that you're talking about reticence and limits, but those limits are part of what makes us free, right?
Well, yeah, again, and I noted this earlier. The FBI, the DOJ, and by extension the FBI. Think about it. We have two charges, really, in many respects. First and foremost, of course, is to protect the American people from domestic and international terrorism. Number one. At the same time, and of equal significance, is the department and the FBI's mandate to protect the civil liberties of all American citizens. We got to do them both at the same time. And that's extremely difficult work, as you might imagine. But again, we don't view these as one particular charge to be, more significant than the other. They have to be taken with equal measure.
So your boss, and I want to now try to elaborate on how difficult this really is. Well, not your boss now, your old, anyway, the head of the FBI said in some testimony recently, he said the amount of there's a lot of adjectives here. The amount of angry, hateful, unspeakable, combative, violent rhetoric on social media exceeds what anybody in their worst imagination thinks is out there. So given that, there's really this volume of angry, hateful, and he says violent rhetoric out there. How does the FBI try to tackle this problem of what you said is identifying indicia of criminal activity when you're looking at a lot of potentially violent rhetoric? And how does the FBI try to sort between the violent rhetoric that is just somebody trying to show somebody else on the internet what a tough badass they are, and violent rhetoric that are signals that somebody is going to maybe do something quite catastrophic?
Yeah, it's not easy. They are in a difficult position, to be sure. That said, that they have mechanisms in place and capabilities that are in place to where they do their best to sort that out and direct those, and again, threats. I mean, they're some of the terminology I'm going to use are legal terms. So those certain rhetoric, which will rise to the level of triggering that law enforcement purpose, they have to sort through that and then identify those that require further investigative measures to be taken, so they can kind of root it out and ensure that that those don't metastasize into something more significant, more serious. There's certain rhetoric that you're going to see that will, on its face, constitute what we call, in a legal term, a true threat. That's something that's criminal in nature on its face. So it's a category of speech that is outside the protective umbrella of the First Amendment and is a criminal offense in and of itself. And if that's the sort of rhetoric we're dealing with, that's immediately actionable.
Can you give us we don't really know what is a true? Give us an example of what you would think of as a true threat that would really trigger a very strong immediate law enforcement response.
Sure. Regrettably, we're seeing quite a bit of threat activity associated with public officials these days. So just a ballpark example here might be something like somebody sending a voicemail to a sitting U.S. senator saying, "I'm going to kill you tomorrow if you vote yes on this bill that's before the Senate, and I'm going to kill your family." That's a pretty solid true threat example that I can provide you. But the problem areas, of course, are the rhetoric. Is the rhetoric that is at the margin. That's not clearly and specifically of the category that would constitute a true threat from a legal perspective, but is nonetheless hateful, vile, and incendiary. And that has proven to be and continues to prove to be and has always proven to be a very difficult challenge.
I'm out there on the internet and I'm in a chat room and I see somebody saying, "I'm so angry at blank people. I just want to kill them all." I refer that as a good citizen over to the FBI. What happens? True threat, or use mechanisms? I think you used the term mechanisms and capabilities. Did look into that deeper, or slough that off because, oh my God, there's, in any given day, there's thousands of people, unfortunately, in our society that say things like that.
Well, I can tell you that anything that's directed to the FBI is not going to slough off. They're going to take it seriously, and they're going to take a hard look at it. And by capabilities, I meant that they have, centers that can process this sort of thing at scale, as it were. And they do a fantastic job in doing just that. Again, understanding this isn't a law school class. These terms, I don't want to get too deep down the rabbit hole of what constitutes a true threat, but suffice it to say, there are a number of factors that go into that equation that are going to be assessed by folks at the FBI, and the FBI is going to have a conversation with their respective counterparts in various U.S. attorneys' offices around the country to discern whether or not that true threat meets the parameters for a potential federal charge. That's the nature of our business. We have those conversations on a daily basis, and they occur all across the country. Moreover, those conversations also occur between our state investigative authorities and state DAs across the country, because our state brethren have any number of statutes on their books that concern threats that differ sometimes from their federal counterparts. So there's a wide array of statutory provisions, both at the state and federal level, to contend with this type of activity, but it does require that discussion between law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities to discern whether or not a particular level of rhetoric rises to the level where it's actionable.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. We're about 60 days away from an election. How is DOJ looking at, not at protecting the election? That's not, there are other parts of the government that deal with protecting the election fraud, but how are you thinking about this as a heightened threat environment because of the passions that are surrounding all elections, but maybe this one and the one in 2 years, because of the circumstances we're all well aware of, and are taking any sort of steps or measures to think through that and prevent possibly, hopefully, any sort of violence that might take place in connection with that.
And again, I feel like I'm kind of saying a lot of what the FBI is or not going to do, and I don't want to get in trouble for speaking for the FBI. But having worked with them and being part of the organization for so many years, I can say that they are well positioned to take a hard look at whatever threat streams may develop at any given time, and to react accordingly. And so I can say with some degree of authority that they are certainly going to be mindful and aware of that the present climate, and that they are postured to deal with it accordingly.
Let's talk a bit about January 6th and the investigation afterwards. I think for most people, the notion that there were, organized groups who organized their activities to come to the Capitol, had various levels of maybe violent weapons and so on with them, might have been the most disturbing part of that episode. And so could you speak a little bit to the seditious conspiracy cases that the DOJ has brought, and what's the significance of that compared to these kind of one-off prosecutions for individuals? We talked a little bit before that you said individuals were the main threat, but here you have the Department of Justice actively prosecuting a group.
Well, I can say what is apparent in public filings, and that is, of course, that there have been instances where loose groups of networked individuals associated with particular organizations have been, we leveraged charges of seditious conspiracy in connection with those organizations. That's about the limit of what I'm really in a position to comment on as it relates to the nature of those charges. As you might imagine, there's ongoing litigation associated with all those cases. But what I can say is that the January 6th event has resulted in hundreds of investigations and prosecutions of individuals from almost every state in the entire country. Litigation associated with those cases is ongoing and likely will continue for some time. And this particular matter constitutes the most complex and wide-ranging investigation and prosecution that the Department of Justice has ever engaged in our entire history. So it's very complicated, it's ongoing, and it does involve certain charges that relate to seditious conspiracy, which is a potent charge. But that's about the limit of what I can comment on with relation to that.
So this issue of domestic terrorism and the ideologies that motivate it is not happening just in the United States. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in other countries around the world. So what can you tell us about potential connectivity between potentially violent domestic actors of whatever ideology here in the United States and connections they might have with like-minded either individuals or organizations abroad? And how does the Department of Justice try to tackle that potential problem?
Right, you're right. What we are seeing is a very it's an interesting and disturbing phenomena wherein we do have U.S. nationals that are engaging with like-minded, as you say, foreign nationals on issues that related, that are broadly associated with white nationalism or other ideologies. This typically occurs in the main in global encrypted online chat platforms, as you might imagine. What are we doing to contend with this? Well, a range of things. Just recently, we convened the first ever counterterrorism law enforcement forum with our foreign partners in Berlin. It was sponsored by Germany, of course. But what it did is it brought together practitioners from around the world who are contending with this similar phenomena, so that we can exchange views and best practices on how best to contend with this new and disturbing phenomena.
Okay, I'd like to have just a couple more questions, so we will pass the microphone around, and please get ready for questions from the audience. I have a couple more items I want to touch on. I'd like if you could maybe discuss the department's approach to, for lack of better term, the kind of summer 2002 protest-related violence or violence that occurred at the same time or during this time period, because in the political sphere, and I know you are not part of that, and you're rightly staying neutral and above that, but a grievance that I've often heard from some is that the Department of Justice is pouring resources and emphasizing the January 6th investigation, relating to the white supremacists and anti-government violent extremists, but hasn't taken that same kind of very hardline kind of approach to the violence that broke out in the summer of 2020. And there are some allegations that that's kind of due to some sort of political, I don't know, lack of a better word, discrimination taking place there. So I know a tricky question, but can you say anything about what the department's response has been to those kinds of allegations?
Well, from my vantage point and where I sit, and I do have the opportunity to see a lot of the activity, the investigative activity and the prosecutorial activity associated with domestic terrorism at a national level, I can say that the unrest that occurred during the course of the summer of 2020 did result in a significant number of cases that we would consider to be domestic terrorism related. So the notion that somehow violence that was done in that context was not construed in any way, shape, or form as domestic terrorism is misplaced in many respects. So that's kind of the most significant point I'd make. And then I'd also note that we need to be mindful that many of the charging determinations that are made in connection with these cases are done by U.S. attorneys in distinct U.S. attorneys' offices all throughout the country who have a significant amount of authority to bring cases as they see fit based on the nature of the criminal activity that's occurring in their respective jurisdictions. And so that's part of it as well. But again, to revert to my previous point, the notion that there were no significant domestic terrorism related activity that occurred during the conduct of the violence associated with the civil unrest over the course of the summer is misplaced, because there certainly was.
Uh, well, some might say that, well, the fact that the Justice Department centralized the January 6th investigation and but let all the U.S. attorneys around the nation, decide for themselves how to deal with summer of 2020 violence isn't of itself a decision, shows that you treated, one form of political violence one way and one form of political violence another way. What did DOJ say to that?
Yeah, and again, I can say that it's touching on some issues that are associated with an event that's presently in litigation. So I'm going to be, I know nobody likes to hear that. Well, I can't really talk about that because
no, it's totally fair
it's
and
totally
appropriate. Yeah,
it's regrettably it's where we sit right now. So that hew's a little bit too close to some of the issues that are bound up in some of the present litigation. So I'm gonna kind of steer clear of that one.
Okay. Got one last question, and I have heard the term salad bar terrorism been used in a couple of. Are you familiar with that?
I am.
Okay. Can you tell the audience what is salad bar terrorism? I'm sure it's not throwing little tomatoes around. Can you tell people what that is? And is this a phenomenon that concerns the and what is some response? What are we thinking about as to why this might be problematic?
It's certainly an issue that we've seen quite a bit of lately, and it's the notion that in many instances we're seeing individuals or sometimes loose networks subscribe to blended idiosyncratic ideologies. So you may think of your archetypical domestic terrorist as like a neo-Nazi dude that's got a swastika carved into his forehead or something like that. That's what everybody sort of labors under that impression. But again, if you consider what I said before, and you look at that statutory definition that I noted earlier, the nature of the ideology itself, is again not our primary focus, and it's certainly a focus. But we focus on those individuals that are in networks and groups that are looking to give effect to that through violence. And so that some of these individuals will build, if you will, their own, as I said before, individualized ideologies. They'll regrettably spend way too much time on the internet and pull down bits and pieces from various streams out there that they can find in the darker corners of the web.
They do their own research.
Exactly. And construct effectively their own ideology. And then what they do, regrettably, in some circumstances, is they give effect to that ideology through violence. Now, it's not cleanly in one category or another. It spans a divide between, maybe it's got a little bit of a white nationalism, maybe it's got a little bit of a environmental extremism, maybe it's got a little bit of a REMV, maybe it's got a little bit of anti-authority, anti-government, and everything in between. And so we're seeing strains of this. One obvious example that comes to mind is this notion of eco-fascism. These ideas don't sit neatly next to each other, and when we think about domestic terrorism, but it's a thing. You can do your own research on it. And so we are seeing a number of individuals and loose networks that then again are cobbling together their own blended ideologies and then regrettably giving effect to that through violence in many circumstances. And another interesting phenomena that has occurred concerns this bleed between what we would typically associate it as domestic, and again, I don't like to characterize an actual ideology as domestic terrorism, because again, we're focusing on the violence here, but ideologies that tend to be closely associated with our domestic terrorist actors, like say, for example, neo-Nazism or what have you, with jihadi elements. So there was a case against a group or organization recently called the Base, actually a number of cases that the DOJ has been in state authorities have been involved in. And this is a broadly neo-Nazi organization that was, a real group that had actually an established ideology and something of a command and control function. And they were looking to do violence in the service of their ideology. But at the same time, they named themselves by design the Base. And of course, for those of you who are, maybe a little bit steeped in the terrorism lingo, that's obviously the English translation for Al-Qaeda. They know this. They did this by design again, and they admitted as such. And so we see this weird blended, and this is just one example of many I could give you of this blended ideology that we sometimes see manifest. Not always, but in certain corners of the domestic terrorism arena.
Okay, I'm sure many of you have questions. Jordan, are you going to bring the microphone around? And I didn't see you here earlier when I thanked the staff, but Jordan also was very instrumental in helping make this event a success. So thank you, Jordan. And welcome to Duke. Yeah, raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and we row, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. All right. Pass it around.
Hi, thank you. I just want to know what's the department's procedure regarding politicians who rile up extremists and potential domestic terrorists, and whether that has changed recently.
Well, I mean, we don't have an official policy with regard to that. Again, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but we're in the business of prosecuting people who commit federal criminal offenses. It doesn't matter who that person might be. So we don't look at their name tag or what kind of pedigree they have. If a person, if we suspect that a person has committed a criminal federal offense, that person, and it relates to domestic terrorism, that person is going to be investigated by the FBI. And if the evidence fits, prosecuted by the DOJ. There
is a federal incitement statute, isn't there?
Well, we have a statute that's called inciting a riot. It's 18 U.S.C. 2101. So we have seen that. It's actually kind of interesting because that's kind of a statute that was passed back in the 60s to contend with a lot of the civil unrest that was going on across the country at that time. Many of you may know, or perhaps maybe you don't know, but there was quite a bit of it. And a lot of it occurred in urban centers. And there was a lot of property damage and a lot of loss of life. And so as a result of that, Congress passed this statute called the incitement to a riot to contend with that sort of activity. It lay dormant for any number of years, but recently, regrettably, we've seen activity that does meet the standard for bringing that charge, and we have brought that charge in connection with some politically motivated violence in the near term, in the recent past.
Okay.
Hi. So at the beginning, you mentioned the definition of domestic terrorism and then said that a lot of it is ethnically motivated and also conducted by lone wolves. Could you explain how that is different from hate crimes in the eyes of the DOJ?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it comes up all the time. So let me just use as an example the Charlottesville incident. You'll all be familiar, of course, with the individual that drove his car into the crowd in Charlottesville back in 2017 during the Unite the Right rally. So that individual was charged with a federal hate crime. And so the thing is, I don't want to get too legal on you guys. I know it's late, but it's late for me anyway. But when I say hate crime as a lawyer and working in the DOJ, what I mean, I'm referring to a very specific federal statute. You can look it up. It's 18 U.S.C. 249. And so when I said we had a statutory definition that defines domestic terrorism, the kicker is we don't have a federal crime that criminalizes domestic terrorism. And that surprises a lot of people. You would assume that, oh, well, there's a federal statute out there that makes it a crime to commit an act of domestic terrorism. That's not the case. There's no such law. And so what we have to do when we're dealing with people that engage in criminal activity that meets that statutory definition, we have to use other statutes in the criminal code to get at that. And one of the main ones that we use regrettably in situations where people have already committed an act of domestic terrorism, we have to figure out, okay, which federal statute, since we don't have a law that criminalizes domestic terrorism, which one can we use and is most appropriate under these circumstances? And in many instances, like the incident in Charlottesville and many others, that statute has been a federal hate crime charge. And really, at its essence, what it criminalizes is somebody that commits violence based on an animus directed towards that person's ethnicity, their religion, their national origin, and a couple of other very narrow categories. So that's the relationship between hate crimes and domestic terrorism. The terms aren't mutually exclusive. A lot of folks figure, well, it's either one or the other. That's not the case. They don't completely overlap, but oftentimes they do. And so they're not mutually exclusive. The hate crimes piece is the statutory vehicle we use. It's the tool we use to prosecute acts of domestic terrorism that meet that statutory definition.
One of the problems here in general is that, these things take place in society, and society talks about them and uses rhetoric and terminology that makes sense to them and debates them using that terminology. And that's important. We should do that. But lawyers and prosecutors have to use particular statutes that have particular titles and so on. And the rhetoric we use to describe certain phenomenon in the public doesn't always neatly match up with the laws that the prosecutors have to use. And sometimes people are frustrated with the department because of that. They don't, and maybe your question kind of went to that. I think we had a question in the back, sir.
Hey, good evening, sir. Jason Oakes, National Defense University. I'm just curious. I realize it's probably out of the purview of the DOJ, but I'm curious if you could speak to what the role of malign foreign influence plays and what those connective tissues look like between other agencies and departments within the government.
Yeah, it's there was recently a case in which the DOJ brought some charges associated with individuals, foreign nationals, that were alleged to have engaged in this very, very similar activity as it related to domestic entities and organizations. So it's certainly a concern. That's something that both the FBI and the DOJ are very much alive to, even as it relates to our understanding of how I've described the scheme as it relates to domestic terrorism. So, it has multiple different facets, many of which I can't really get into, but we are concerned about it. And there is, we are looking at it through various different lenses, including through the lens of potential domestic terrorist activity.
Okay, can we get the microphone? Well, why don't we do the person right next to him, and then we'll come down here. How's that?
Hi, thank you very much for your comments this evening. Chris Buck from National Defense University. I was wondering if you could elaborate potentially on any sort of distinctions that the department makes on narco-terrorism along the southern border. I think maybe I can intuit that you would apply kind of a similar framework in terms of using existing statutes, but are there any specific distinctions that you have in terms of enforcing those from a cross-border kind of perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I will say that I'm not really in a position to comment, unfortunately, with any particular detail on the narco terrorism piece. But that is something that is of significant concern. It's something that our counterparts in the National Security Division are looking closely at, and we have recently leveraged some statutes that typically aren't associated with that in connection with narco terrorist activity. In the last, I think it was in the last 6 months or so. So it's something you might want to consider. We can talk offline about it if you like. But really, it's that bit right there is a little bit outside of my remit. I focus exclusively on the DT piece.
Hi, we have some questions up here in the front. Where's the mic? We want to use the mic because we do have people who are listening on the webinar, so it's very important for them to hear the questions. I think we have okay, go ahead, sir, and then the person in the green shirt next to you.
Investigating the Ku Klux Klan, the FBI used a lot of tactics such as informants and infiltration. And I'm just wondering if those, given the constraints that you mentioned earlier about constitutional rights, if those tactics are still viable with current investigations with other groups that are deemed dangerous. And in that connection, you also just talked about mechanisms and capabilities. If Congress was at your door begging to enact a law that you wanted, what would you ask them for? What would you see that would pass muster with the Supreme Court?
Yeah, great questions. And I can say that the way that the FBI works is they're going to have certain investigative techniques that are available to them depending on the level of investigation that they've initiated. So if they initiated a low-level investigation, there are certain investigative techniques that they can leverage. If it's a little bit intermediate, they have more of an indicia of criminality, they get to access more and more potent investigative techniques. And then if it's like a full field investigation, they call it, then they have the authority to leverage even more investigative techniques. So it's a tiered response, as you would imagine. And of course, they typically will operate by using the least intrusive investigative means at the outset. And then they will slowly build a case as the circumstances require. So, I'm not going to get into the specifics of what those techniques are at this point, but that's generally speaking how they approach these cases. On the statutory piece, we get this question all the time. Folks want to know, like, well, are there additional measures that can be brought to bear? I think the position of the DA is that we're open to whatever Congress might put forward. That's something that we will certainly take under advisement and assess. I mean, it's lawyer speak. I know you're grimacing already. I hear you. But that's kind of where we sit on that. We have internally put forward some tweaks to existing legislation that we think might be somewhat beneficial, that we have in our back pocket. But again, those are still under advisement right now. But in the main, we're open to what Congress might put on the table, and we'll take it under advisement if we see it.
Okay, sir, you already asked two. That's the gentleman next to you.
So I recognize that you said that the current threat is generally from lone wolf extremists, but it seems like increasingly the more potent threat is from more organizationally based actors. I was wondering what the potential is that you see for using federal organized crime statutes to pursue organizations like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there historically, I can say, and I think you're probably referring to like RICO charges and things of that nature that are typically leveraged in connection with organized criminal syndicates. As I said before, we have the entire code book at our disposal. So there's only a handful of statutes that are off the table as they relate to a potential domestic terrorism incident. And those statutes would obviously be geared almost exclusively towards international terrorism issues. But RICO is one of them. And we have brought RICO charges in connection with domestic terrorist organizations in the past. It's been a little while, but there are concrete historical examples where we've done just that successfully, mind you. So it's not off the table. It's something that we're entertaining as we look at how the threat picture evolves over time.
Thank you so much for your time today. I wanted to go back briefly to your discussion about thinking about the threat environment leading up to the upcoming elections. And you mentioned looking to see what threat streams may develop at any time and reacting accordingly. You mentioned reaction in word, but also the description seems to be more proactive. Could you talk a little bit about the DOJ and FBI's work and how it's divided between reacting and being proactive to different things?
Well, yeah. So there's a component that's mapped out in the new strategy that I referenced earlier, the national level strategy for countering domestic terrorism. And one of it's broken into 4 pillars, basically. The first pillar concerns understanding the threat and sharing information about it. The second prong concerns what we call prevention. The third is disruption. That's kind of your hard-edged domestic terrorist investigations and prosecutions. That's kind of the business that I'm in. For the most part. And then the fourth prong concerns long-term contributors to the general climate that might give rise to some of this activity. So I think what you're getting at is the prevention piece. And there are a range of agencies and institutions, including the DOJ to some respect, that are engaged with efforts to try to prevent people from taking on these ideologies in the first place. And certainly prevent them from giving effect to them through violence. And that effort is ongoing, and it oftentimes will take the form of grants through the NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, for example, or other entities within the DOJ for further study and research on best practices and how to do that. But that's difficult work, to be sure. The Department of Homeland Security is also heavily invested in that effort as well. So yes, so there are a number of federal agencies and departments whose work concerns prevention. It's next door to the prime work that I do, but I'm certainly aware of and privy to a lot of the the initiatives that are directed towards that end. In fact, if you look and do a quick Google search, you'll find that the White House just recently announced a new initiative through their Domestic Policy Council that is broadly associated with what I think you're getting after. So that might be worth a look.
Do we have any more folks who'd like to ask questions? Oh, hi, Ruthie. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you again for coming, sir. This has been so interesting. I'm curious on how you would respond to or reassure people on the right who are turning on their news every day and watching the news about President Trump and fear that the DOJ has become an overly politicized organization. And further, what are some of the negative ramifications of this declining trust on the department's work?
Yeah, and I'm not going to pretend that the environment that we're operating in is concerning. I think that our senior leadership has indicated as much. It's a problem when we've got FBI agents that are out there doing, God's work, protecting the broader public from the scourge of domestic and international terrorism, and they go home and they're getting threats from individuals to the death threats to them and their families. That's not a model environment in which to work. That said, I can tell you at my level, that is in no way, shape, or form deterred the agents and DOJ personnel on the ground that do this work every day, because they've taken this on as this commitment is a real commitment to them in the sense that they have sworn an oath in many respects to again protect the broader public from domestic and international terrorism, while at the same time, to your second point, upholding the civil liberties of every American citizen. That's our charge. That's our mandate. And so, we take it seriously. The folks that are on the razor's edge, regrettably, they are being forced to work in an environment that just makes that work even more difficult. But I can tell you, they're undissuaded in terms of getting after that. Thanks for the question.
Well, it seems to me that's a very powerful note on which to conclude this evening. I want to thank everybody for turning out and your really fantastic questions. And I especially want to thank our guest. You've had such a long and distinguished career in public service, but coming here and he's been answering questions for 7 hours in a row now. So not only has he, unfortunately not created any news stories, but he's shown tremendous endurance. And I think, the sensitivity that I think he demonstrated in the really the important competing values that are at stake, trying to prevent, very dangerous, not just in loss of life, but in loss of public confidence and what it does to communities, to prevent those kinds of actions from happening and tearing communities apart and getting Americans angry at each other. That's critically important, but he's also shown how much care our public servants have to take in order to do that in a way that is consistent with the rule of law, which is another critical value of our democracy. So, Tom, for all you've done professionally and for what you've done for our community today and in coming and talking to us, I want to thank you so much.